Welcome to another episode of the Ask a CISO podcast, powered by Harangi, Asia's leader in cloud security. Every episode, you get insider tips and insights into current challenges and newest trends in cybersecurity from the world's best experts to help level up your cybersecurity career. Here's your host, Paul Hadji, to introduce today's guest.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Ask a CISO podcast, powered by Harangi. I'm Rafael Pere, the Vice President of Product here at Harangi, and I'll be sitting in for Paul, our CEO, this week. Before I introduce our guest, please don't forget to like and subscribe or follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts and help us grow. With me today is Fabrice Marie, the co-founder and CTO of cybersecurity startup Evren. Evren helps enterprises improve productivity by simplifying end-user, IT, and security processes for their workforce, so teams can focus on what matters, growing the business and staying competitive. Fabrice has over 20 years experience in the security and risk management field and previously worked as CISO at Air Asia and Lazada. Evren isn't his first cybersecurity startup either, as he was co-founder and CTO of Kibin Labs as well. Hi, Fabrice, and welcome to Ask a CISO podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. The question I like to start with to kind of get us warmed up is, how did you become interested in information security?
I'm pretty sure most of people would have answered the same as me, a small movie called War Games. It's everybody of my generation who became a hacker later on was because of this. I was also very interested very early on in programming, and it's something that there was a natural progression, from programming to operating system, to understand how they work, to understand how you can bypass them, to hacking, and then to more official security jobs, I would say.
I think it's really interesting, this idea of there are these moments of popular culture that can really change the field. And if War Games, that's not actually, that is the first time I've heard that specific one.
I must be the old man in the lot then, because everybody of my age will answer the same story, War Game.
Well, that's good. So basically what you're saying is we need one for the current generation to try to help fix kind of the talent shortage that we have, fill in these roles, get more people on board. Absolutely.
I would say hackers tried to do this in the 90s, and then you had more swordfish in the 2000s, but that wasn't quite about hacking. Yes, absolutely. They need to be more popular culture to bring and to magnet people around the profession, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. So you've had a large kind of range of experience across lots of different industries, types of organizations, different sizes. What are the principles that guide you when you're thinking about security, coming from all of these different experiences?
You mean as a CISO or as a career progression?
I would say in terms of how you think about security as your role as a CISO, obviously you're going to have some views on that, but even when you're slightly younger in your career, for those that are listening that aren't CISOs yet and that aspire to be there, right? What are the principles that you should stick to? Those things that shouldn't really evolve in how you think about these problems.
So when I was younger and more on the pure technical side of security, my drive was technical correctness and absolute security, which is totally not what you should be doing as a CISO. But it is a great learning curve to understand the technology behind security and to understand technology as a whole. Most often people are using technology they do not understand or do not understand fully, and therefore make mistakes. So my guiding principle has always been one of deeper knowledge, or at least trying to get the deepest knowledge possible on any topic before I even speak about it. Otherwise, you can't talk about something you don't know, or at least I wouldn't dare.
So what I'm hearing is that this first one is you need to understand deeply. Otherwise, how can you even talk about the subject? And I understand how that for security is particularly relevant, because if you don't understand deeply, then, the attackers that are on the other side already have a leg up compared to you. But then you mentioned a second one, which is, well, maybe I'm going to use my own terms for this. It sounds like, well, at the end of the day, security is a risk management profession. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that everybody sees it that way?
Absolutely. I mean, it is, and it must be in a way, because if it isn't, and if it is absolute, like what I was thinking when I was 20 years old, people will bypass it. The goal of security is to be unbypassable by attackers, but also by your own users. If your users bypass your own security, then you're in deep trouble. And the learning journey for a technical person, myself, learning more the management part of security and so on, was really to understand that if you make something too difficult, if you have friction or things like this, the user will simply bypass you and shoot himself in the foot.
So this is the, post it with a complex password type workaround that might actually worsen your security posture because you haven't taken into consideration
Exactly.
real humans. Okay.
So earlier on in the career, I was mostly focused on finding technical creative ways to secure companies. It was more like a technical challenge, more fun and so on. And as my career grew, it was more of finding a people way of how to fix the situation. What's in it for them? What do the users need? And once you understand this, you have to get creative to cobble it together with the rest of the IT policies and the rest of the existing infrastructures and so on to make it the most secure possible. But it will, to answer your earlier question, it will remain a game of risk because everything has a cost, be it in time or be it in money. And you have only 24 hours a day. There's so much you can do, even with a large IT security team.
Which a lot of organizations, unfortunately, don't have, or at least not today. Great. I feel like this is actually a pretty good segue into learning a little bit more about your new startup, Evren. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So Gaurav and I founded this company after working together at two different companies in Lazada and then Air Asia. We were facing the same problem in both companies, and across all the other companies I did consulting for, right? So because before Lazada, I did a lot of pen test consulting with 100 over customers. So I've seen a lot of these issues before, and I haven't seen a single proper answer. I've seen only parts of the answer. The main challenge was a challenge of simplifying IT and helping the IT managers do their job, which in turn helps the InfoSec team to help the IT guys doing their job too. So the main issue was really to integrate everything that a operating system should have at the baseline must be built into the OS, obviously. And that wasn't the case. So naturally, I went out as a CISO looking for solutions that I could apply right now with the infrastructure we had right then. And there was nothing. All the tools I could find were sometimes good, but poorly integrated with each other, not following standards. Everybody had an admin interface that they wanted you to use. There was no way to use APIs, pull out the data, or to integrate with other tools. There was no way to automate half the things we wanted to automate. It felt very 90s, When I look at the security solutions out there back in Lazada time, it really felt like very 90s. How are we not doing this in 2015 back then? Yeah. And when we started the company, Gaurav and I, we still felt like, why isn't it like this in 2020? So we started a company and made it happen.
What's the number one, or actually, it sounds like there are two problems that you're kind of solving together. One is an IT perspective, which is going to be primarily around how is it manageable? How does it scale? And then there's another side, which is the security side. I guess, how do you find the balance between the two?
Well, I would say there is no balance, but there is my usual speak. When you get a telephone like this, all you want is a telephone. You did not buy a security product. This is not a security product, but you do expect it to be secure. You do not care how they do it. You just want it to be secure. Well, an OS is the same. You want your OS to be secure. You don't necessarily want to bother about the security. Doesn't mean you are not security aware. You want the security. It's just that, one, you don't want to pay for it. Two, you don't want to waste your time with it. Three, you expect it to work out of the box. And those three conditions are not met otherwise. And so our founding principle was security must be built in and transparent, so the user doesn't need to see it, neither does the admin. It must not create any friction, So in order to be really transparent, you cannot be seen, right? If you are seen, you create friction, then you're not transparent. So it goes together. So those two were really the guiding principles. And the third one, of course, was to enable scale of management of a large IT fleet, which means automation, and obviously centralization.
So obviously the operating systems most people know, you're going to have Windows, you're going to have Mac OS, for servers and kind of like more niche, consumers, you're going to have some different variants of Linux. Why do you need a new one? How does it compare to what you're seeing today in the organizations that you've had experience?
When we started this company, people ask us, why don't you make an agent that does everything that you do? And I smile and I say, because of experience. Because of experience, I've seen agents that were good at a particular point in time that become completely crippled the minute you have a Windows update. Or the same on Mac OS and so on. Apple changes something in the kernel, suddenly your IT security tool stops working, and the vendor has no control whatsoever over it. Because they do not own the code, or they don't have access to the code that Apple provides. So we are built on top of Fedora, which means we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We spin it, as it's called in Fedora parlance, with our own opinionated version of security. It is an OS for the desktop, so it's been geared toward the desktop and pre-selected packages and so on for the desktop, not for the server. It is to be for the enterprise, so it has to be secure by default, cannot be turned off. So again, a lot of opinionated choices have been made to target specifically the enterprise for the desktop. It is not a new operating system per se, as in if you have any application that works on Linux, it will happily work on Evren. But it is a new mentality. It is an OS that's centrally managed with a few clicks of your mouse on an admin portal that is designed to be simple with yes, no, toggles, and things like this. You don't need to mess around with GPO, which is super powerful, but you need guys who write script all day and test them and whatnot. All this work has been done for you.
It sounds like part of what you've done is instead of relying on an operating system, then putting a layer on top and risking things breaking at the interface there, which is not in your control as a vendor, baking that all in and saying like, okay, actually it necessarily needs to be a single piece. And while we're at it, because you're using, a lot of people, when they think of Linux, they're like, oh, isn't that what like nerds use and everything's possible and it's super configurable, which means that for IT managers, it's a nightmare precisely because of the options. It seems like what you've done is you've based it off of that and then in a way simplified by making those choices by default for the organization so that then you only have a very limited surface area of configuration that they actually need to handle.
Absolutely. That was exactly what we had in mind. We keep a lot of customization possible, but a lot of it is not within your control as a user, and we will not give it to you. Like the hard disk is encrypted, and that's final. You don't have to argue about this. It is like this, and it's done. You will never be admin on your machine because you don't need to. Again, the system has been done so that either the admin can push configuration and applications and so on remotely, or you can self-service within the policy using a software that's already pre-installed on the machine. I mean, a lot of advances have been done in IT and management by these guys, by phones and tablets. They simplified IT. But this has not been done yet on the OS, on the laptop. Sorry, because Android is a good OS. I'm talking about on laptops, nobody has done it. Today you buy a Windows or you buy a Mac and you bought a 9095 kind of technology. It is standalone and that's it. Not enterprise.
So are you referring here to kind of manageability by the enterprise, for mobile devices? For those that know this area, you're going to have mobile device management type solutions that help to manage fleets of devices, including more complicated cases like some are company owned, some are personal devices, etc. Is that kind of what you're trying to bring here to the desktop management space?
Absolutely. So we have MDM built in and all of this built in. I mean, again, we stand on shoulders of giants on Fedora, and then we look at what iOS and Android have done and so on. I mean, nobody has the monopoly of good ideas, right? So we just bring those good ideas to the desktop OS, full-blown desktop OS, where you can run some heavy tasks like video editing if you want to and whatnot.
So there's this concept that I understood you're, thinking of your solution as, which is an enterprise OS for the cloud era. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that means for you and like, how does the cloud fit into this at all if we're talking about, a desktop operating system?
I mean, let's face it, since 2000, operating system should have been controlled centrally from the cloud. It wasn't called cloudware back then, but it's the same. The idea is today you consume everything is a SaaS or a PaaS. You still do a lot on your laptop, but a lot of things are online. And the idea is that it should be completely manageable online. Your IT guys should be remote, if anything, or they should control with 5 toggles and things like this. Gone are the days when you're supposed to write scripts just to configure stuff. That is our job. That's not your job.
So it sounds like why the cloud piece here? Well, before on-prem, you needed to manage everything yourself with all of the different details and all of the intricacies for every single organization. And now with the cloud, you flip a switch and it's there. Is that a good way to see it?
It is, absolutely. And the idea is that this is very interesting with the remote working experience as well. Since after COVID, during COVID and after COVID, everybody started to work from home a whole lot more. You have the pros and cons of VDI versus direct with zero trust and so on. We made the choice of doing a local S, but it's cloud ready, zero trust ready, by controlling all the aspects of the security of the machine locally.
So how has this COVID pandemic changed things for you? Was it partly due to this that you decided that this was the time to start your company? What has it meant for your organization?
It was a combination of a lot of things. First, it's something I wanted to do 20 years ago. Second, Gaurav and I had the same drive to do something now that COVID has hit. We wanted to do something around zero trust, but then we realized that not only there's a lot of competition, but they're not focusing on what matters. The missing piece of zero trust is how secure is your endpoint before allowing you to cross zones and so on. And that part is not done right. That part is done by a myriad of vendors who focus on their little thing. Very well, they do it very well, but they don't look at the overall health of the OS, because otherwise there's an agent that will break every time there's an OS upgrade. So that is the same story. Now with COVID hitting, we realize that this is even more the time to do it. So the Linux desktop now is a lot more mature. It's very usable. I'm using our OS right now. It has all the bells and whistles and so on that you would expect. It wasn't the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago to install Linux, you had to know the frequency of your monitor. And if you screwed that up, it would blow up if you changed the mod line wrongly. Now you can install our OS by just clicking on the web UI, generate an ISO, put it on a USB stick, boot your USB stick in USB mode, and enter your Wi-Fi password. Then go for a coffee. It will take 20 minutes and install without asking you a single other question. So how is that for simple?
Yeah.
So this is tremendous for remote workers. We're even looking at it now for in case there is disaster recovery needed. So you can use an OVA image with our OS on it. The user simply double click on it on his home machine. And sure, it's running in a VM, but it's running a secure OS that talks back to your main infrastructure and so on in a controlled way. So we have quite a few versions of the product that makes it interesting and fitting, I would say, the times.
What does your competition look like today?
So our main competition, I would say, would be Chrome OS, even though it is slightly different because they took a different gambit. That gambit has paid very well. Most of the apps now are web-based, so if you need only web-based, they have a very compelling offering. We come from the point of view that a computer should do more than run a browser, but we do have a lot in common with Google Chrome OS. Otherwise, there's also a product called iGel. The folks over at iGel have done a great job at doing an OS for thin clients. They originally focused a lot on VDI. I think now they're trying to make a play for the rest as well. So I would say those are the two main competitors for us, yes.
And why Singapore?
Why Singapore? Singapore was historical for me. As a student, I told everyone I would do an internship in security on Linux and overseas. Everybody laughed at my face, and 6 months later, I sent them a postcard from Thailand where I was developing a payment gateway system to accept credit card in 1999. So one of the first, I think the first in Thailand. And after this, wanted to move to a faster paced city, so immediately moved to Singapore. So Linux, then security and Linux, and then pure pen testing company I started in 2000. So I stayed in Singapore now 23 years.
Wow. How do you think Singapore differs from, maybe let's say, how do you think Asia, because Singapore is often seen as kind of a regional hub for many organizations, how does Asia differ from other parts of the world with regards to how they approach security?
I would say it's mostly a matter of risk appetite and also creativity. So in Asia, for risk appetite, there is unfortunately a bad trend, which is let's see how it happens in US and Europe, and then we'll take it later on. And the risk appetite is also not very willing to take risks, to have they have their head on the chopping board if something goes wrong. So this is changing. Luckily, the last 20 years, it has changed a lot. But in some older and more traditional companies here, it's still like this, where people don't dare to make changes, don't dare to take risks. And by taking risk, I mean talking about using a different approach for security or buying different products or testing new methodologies, these kind of things. And I think this is the part where Singapore and the rest of Asia can enhance.
Obviously, traditional organizations, very different from the tech new players like Lazada. Are you seeing similar kinds of things there? Do they take more risks? Do they have more to try different things?
So yeah, some startups are taking crazy risks. Some of the unicorns, including Lazada, were taking crazy risk. I mean, as far as a CISO is concerned, of course, compared to other startups of their generation, there was a lot of security built in and whatnot. The engineers that worked there were smart and security conscious. So it's not like the company was naked. But yeah, I think that the startups of today take a lot more risks, but sometimes without thinking about the consequences. We always need a measured approach. I mean, it's the same within our own company, right? I mean, we come from a security background, so we want to put security everywhere within our own corporation. But we can't be doing too much of this at our stage, otherwise it would completely stifle creativity and the pace of releasing a new product. So now, of course, the product itself is very secure because it's the center of excellence and that's the targets that the product is trying to achieve. But can we enhance the internal security in terms of the people-centric part of it? Of course we can, and we will, when the time is right.
How do you think, and particularly organizations that are either new, so this is going to be obviously all of the startups that are still very new to cybersecurity and might not have a lot of the processes that more established organizations have, but also, obviously in our field, we're seeing a lot of organizations migrating to the cloud, and the cloud is very new. And so I take a lot of parallels there because I feel like it's kind of the same. You're starting from zero in a way in that field. How would you suggest people approach that?
When you start from zero a company, I would say the most important advice I can give you is keep in a file somewhere the list of things that you have, the list of accounts you open with the various SaaS and PaaS. Because before you know it, you have 20 and 6 months later, you don't remember which account you have on which PaaS. And those will come bite you later on, so it is very basic, but asset management to me is still the number one problem in every organization, large or small. When I was CISO in Lazada, I was struggling with asset management because we were really, really deployed everywhere in 6 countries and in big and large locations in those countries. It was really a challenge. But at the same time, I discussed with my friend from the large established banks, and apparently they too had some servers they were not aware of and so on. So I had a little bit of a grin on my face, feeling a little bit better. But I wish that onto no one. So obviously asset management to me is the most important. And the second part is the people. So if you start a new company now, remember security is PPT, people, process, and technology. The T is last. Let's make no mistake on that. If the people are more security conscious, T can come last. But it is, if you want to do a full circle, it will be people, process, and technology. And always start with the simple things that have a high value, the so-called low-hanging fruits. There are plenty. So keep asset management, be tidy in how you code. Even if you're not a good security coder, but if you code properly, it will be more secure than if you don't, and so on. So it's all these little things at the beginning of a company that makes a big difference later, I think.
So it sounds, start with the basics, start with the hygiene, think people first. If you don't have, get people that are thinking about security rather than getting tools to try to help fix a gap of people that are doing all the wrong things. Okay, cool. I think that's
Absolutely.
very much in line with how we think of things, which is don't bite off more than you can chew. Take it easy.
And keep it simple as well. The KISS principle is still key in security. Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing that we sometimes see is some organizations that want everything so customized, and I imagine that you might see this in my past history. We had people asking for very specific combinations of password complexity requirements. It needed to be very specific, 9 characters, not 8 or 10, 9 with these specific characters considered special characters. And we couldn't convince them by any means that they could just accept the 8 or 10 that we currently have. So hopefully, people will be a little more understanding in the future about the fundamental pieces rather than the details that we sometimes get a little too focused on.
Absolutely. But talking about detail for this particular problem, what a vendor can do is to offer more API and callbacks. So for this, you could have a callback back to the customer for them to validate the password. And often when making APIs, people forget about callback, where you can let the customer decide how they want it by just calling back their code. One signature I would say that I imposed on Lazada was automating everything as much as possible, because we were a very small team for a very large organization. And so the more we automate, the more we can do, right? And to automate, we had to query from APIs. We had to even use Selenium to get to web UIs that didn't have any APIs. So if you develop a product today, if your listeners are developing a product today, think about the APIs. The product, as you said, will never be alone in a company. There will always be an existing ecosystem. And you can't be thinking about how to integrate with everything. Of course, you should and do the most, but the customer knows better. So let the customer do it themselves through an API.
We've even seen the emergence over the last few years of some companies that are kind of API only. It's like their whole product is an API. So it's definitely a nice area that we're seeing. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we end, is there something that you would like to tell our listeners today? If there's one thing that they should be focusing on in their career in information security, what should it be?
To me, if you want to do information security, you have to know how to code. Across my career, I've seen a lot of InfoSec people that do not know how to code. It's okay if you don't code anymore, but if you've never coded, get to it. Even if you will not use it every day, it will make you understand a lot of things. Like I said, it's PPT, but the T part now is overgrown, and is overly complex. And so everybody now focused on the T, the PPT. And to really understand the T part of PPT, you have to have some coding experience. You have to understand how an OS boots even. People don't even know that. So focus a bit on that would be my advice, yes.
Perfect. And there's a little bit of coming full circle here compared to earlier in the conversation, which is, understand things deeply, because without that, you're kind of scratching the surface and you're going to be beaten by any other adversary that has.
Hackers don't scratch the surface. Hackers know the stuff inside out. Exactly. So if you only scratch the surface, you'll be an easy target.
Cool. Well, once again, thanks for coming on to the podcast, Fabrice. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and I hope you did too. To those listening in, thanks for tuning in. Once again, this is the Ask a CISO podcast and this is Raphael Perret signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.